Cinema Psych podcast.
At that moment, I knew, surely and clearly, that I was witnessing perfection.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and today's episode is a trip down a period piece lane. So we are going to be talking about A River Runs Through It. This drama came out in 1992. It was directed by Robert Redford, and it is the adaptation of a memoir by Norman MacLean, who is played by Craig Sheffer. Brad Pitt, in one of his early roles, kills it. He's so good. Tom Skerritt as the Reverend MacLean, one of his best performances, and then a few other people here and there. Joseph Gordon-Levitt's first movie role, like with actual lines and stuff. And so if you've never seen this film, it is a story about two brothers and their father and the nature and allegory of fly fishing and how fly fishing intersects the life of these three men, and how various aspects of their lives are seen through this lens. Now, at the recording of this episode, A River Runs Through It is available on IMDb TV, which means that you can watch it for free with ads. I don't know how long it's going to last. So, if you listen to this several months from when I recorded or when it was released, then it may not be available. But if you have some inkling, I mean, Brad Pitt just does a phenomenal job in this film. So I do definitely recommend it. I do want to add the spoiler warning.
Spoiler time.
So just in case, our discussion ruins anything for you, though the end is a bit telegraphed, I will say. So please join us for this episode as we discuss A River Runs Through It. My guest host today is friend of the show, Jason Spiegelman. Jason, how are things going in the age of the COVID pandemic? I understand you recently finished a summer course, right?
Right. Well, thank you for having me back. I'm really pleased to join you again. In the age of COVID, teaching has become a brave new world, and I just finished an in-person summer class. Thankfully, I have avoided the Rona, and in a couple weeks, we'll try again.
All right. I mean, I as of this recording, I am back at it. Tomorrow is first day of classes, so we'll see what that's like. What is that like?
We'll hope that your college doesn't go the way of the University of North Carolina. I think it took them all of a week to give up. So
same thing with Notre Dame. Yeah,
Notre Dame. Yeah.
Well, welcome back, Jason. So today, as I said at the top of the show, we are going to be talking about a fairly interesting period piece, and I don't think we have had a period piece on the show yet. I'm sure there'll be another one coming up, but just because period pieces are all over the place. But we're gonna do some fly fishing, right? So right. A River Runs Through It. What's up with this choice?
So this is one that I have really had sort of an affinity for a number of years. it's sort of hard to explain exactly why, but when I talk to my students about movies for psychology papers that I assign, this is always in the list.
Mm-hmm.
And the lucky or unlucky student who gets this one, I always tell them the same thing. I tell them this is one of my 5 top movies of all time. It is one that you're going to have to be a little patient with because it is not about fishing. You sort of have to look past that. And it's one of those movies that I make it a point to go back and watch at least once every 5 or 6 months. And it sort of helps me get my perspective back on the world around me. And I'm not really sure why, but this movie has always just spoken to me, and I enjoy watching it a couple times a year.
Couple times a year. That is a time investment. So I like the choice. I like that you sort of went outside of the box with this choice, as opposed to maybe something that is more accessible on the minds of psychologists. So I like the choice. I am glad that you finally made me watch it, because it's been around for a long time. It's been around for the vast majority of my life. But I have to say that I have mixed feelings about the movie. So before we get into the psychology stuff, I do want to just go back and forth here about the film in general. So of the things that I did not like about the film were its length and pacing. It is too slow. There are too many scenes where people are just staring at each other.
I think that's probably accurate. At the same time, I don't know if I would give the producers of the film credit for doing that intentionally, but maybe part of the sort of underlying message, maybe the meta message there is we're supposed to slow down. A lot of the movie focuses on calm your mind, listen to the babbling brook, listen to the river, go and just be. So I wonder if the pacing of the movie is intentional to reinforce the message that it drives from the memoir from which it was written.
I disagree. Yes, I understand what you're talking about with the idea about stop and smelling the roses. But the end of the film comes way too abruptly. So that's a pacing problem from a filmmaking perspective. We are not given enough information about Paul's character throughout the film. And that may be part of the memoir aspect of it, but it just seems to end too abruptly. And spoiler alert: Paul dies. Yes, Brad Pitt does die. And I just felt
Yay.
like no yays.
Yay.
I just felt like that came too quick. That was just like and now we have to talk about his the fact that he died.
And I would disagree with you, because it felt to me like that was foreshadowed repeatedly throughout the movie, particularly in the scene, which, we'll get to the different scenes that we're going to talk about.
I think it was don't get me wrong. It was foreshadowed, and I knew he was going to die.
You just felt it was sort of all of a sudden he's dead.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It was a matter of telling versus showing, and I want my movies to show me and not tell me. And I understand that it's from a memoir and it's from a book, and so the adaptation doesn't come across the same way as if you were to read it. And I think that may be the issue that I'm having with it. That's all. I mean, as far as its pacing if that was and that's my only knock. If that was an egregious thing for a film, then I would have said, "Hey, Jason, I hate you for making me watch this." But pacing is not terrible. I'll tell you the things that I do like about it. So I loved Brad Pitt. This is one of his early roles, and he killed it. Pun intended. He killed it. He did so well. And I also enjoyed the fly fishing. I'm not a fisherman
person.
Yeah. I've fished before. I've bait fished before. I've never fly fished. But I did enjoy it. Robert Redford did a very good job with that, and then whoever the cinematographer was impeccable. And the allegory with the fly fishing was phenomenal. So
absolutely,
I'll give you that.
Yeah, and this is interesting that you say that, because there are a few things that I dislike more than fishing. If I want fish, I'll go to the store and I'll buy a fish, and I'll save myself 4 hours and some sunburn. But watching this movie and watching the way they sort of spiritualize the ritual of fly fishing really does make me want to go out, buy some waders, and learn how to do it for a day, and stand out there and just sort of commune with nature, which is 180 degrees the opposite of the kind of person I am.
Yeah.
But they make it look like something that would really be an enjoyable experience. So I would agree with you.
Yeah.
In addition to Brad Pitt's amazing performance, another really amazing performance in this film was that of Tom Skerritt, who plays the Reverend McLean, the father figure. And in doing a little bit of research for our talk today, I uncovered a little tidbit that Skerritt reports that this is his favorite performance of his career. And I think with really good reason. It's an exceptional performance of a very complicated character.
Yeah, who doesn't have a terrible amount of screen time because it's not really about him. But in the scenes that he does have, it's like, whoa. To have a dad like that, whoa.
Sure, and although he doesn't have a lot of screen time, in many of the scenes where he's not there, he's still there. And I think that is one of the really interesting facets of the character. Maybe not the performance, but the character himself. There's so many times when his influence is coming through the secondary characters of the sons that I think is really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so before we get into some of the more nuanced psych stuff, because that is the nature of this show, I do want to remind everyone that you have been on this program before. So go check out episode, I think it was 3, where we talked about Inception.
Wow.
Exactly. And if you want some giggles, because I haven't met a person yet that I've shared this with. If you want some giggles, check out the blooper for that. I put it on YouTube. Check out the blooper for that. I will link it in this episode's description, just in case anybody wants to go listen to that. But Jason, are you honored to be here?
It is definitely my honor to be here today.
It is.
What an honor it is for me to be here.
Exactly. And that's not pretentious at all. All right. So the psych now. Let's get into some of the nuts and bolts. Because as we talked about right before we started recording, we sort of agreed on how the psych concepts aren't blaringly obvious. You kind of have to dig for them, and so it's more thematic than anything, right? So the one thing that I do want to mention before I let you have the floor, Jason, is something that I'm going to be talking about quite a bit this semester, and so that's why like really just screamed at me as I was watching this, is the intro part of the film when they are children. Robert Redford is narrating the memoir as old Norman McLean, and he's talking about their childhood and when their father took them out to go fishing for the first time. So I'm going to go ahead and play that clip of Norman describing how the father taught them how to fly fish.
So my brother and I learned to cast Presbyterian style, on a metronome. He began each session with the same instruction. Casting is an art that is performed on a 4-count rhythm between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. If he had had his way, nobody who did not know how to catch a fish would be allowed to disgrace a fish by catching it. So it was with my formal education as well. Each weekday while my father worked on his Sunday sermon, I attended the school of the Reverend McLean. He taught nothing but reading and writing, and, being a Scot, believed that the art of writing lay in thrift.
Half as long.
So while my friends spent their days at Missoula Elementary, I stayed home and learned to write the American language.
Again, half as long. Good. Now throw it away.
So you see from that really interesting description is just how much procedural memory plays a role, skill building. It's an art form as it's described in the movie. How to properly fly fish, which you can't just grab a pole and go out in the middle of a stream and think you're going to catch some trout or some bass. It's just not going to happen, right? You have to learn how to properly do it. And so I'm going to be talking about procedural memory quite a bit this semester because I'm teaching memory. And it's a great example, actually, of somebody taking a skill that they have and describing it in a little bit more than dry step by step, right?
No, absolutely. And I think that in addition to just the procedural memory, sort of what goes from being very controlled to automatic and therefore implicit, is the emotional attachment that's associated with the memories.
Yeah.
And the very powerful line is, as the Reverend is teaching his son how to fish, I'm going to get the quote a little bit wrong, but nobody who doesn't know how to catch a fish should be allowed to dishonor the fish by catching it. And so you're going to learn the way I have learned, and there is no other right way to do it.
Right.
And that sets up, of course, a very powerful scene later in the movie when Paul's character decides to break free of his father's teaching and do this new kind of casting that he taught himself. They called it shadow casting. And sort of the moment when the child breaks free from the parent, the bird flies the nest, so to speak. So sort of procedural memories linking with episodic memories and emotional involvement.
I then saw something remarkable. For the first time, Paul broke free of our father's instruction into a rhythm all his own.
And the last thing I'll mention about that is that when Norman comes back from Dartmouth after 6 or 7 years, he goes fly fishing again with Paul, and Paul makes a joke about how his form is a bit rusty, but then only a few minutes later he regains his form, right? It's like the old phrase, it's like the old adage, it's like riding a bike, right? Because once we learn how to balance on a bike, we can get, even if we haven't ridden a bike in years and years and years and years, we can get back on a bike and be like, oh yeah, I know how to balance on this thing. And so I thought that was a great little nugget to go that goes all the way back to that first scene when they were learning how to fly fish. That's why procedural memory is so amazing.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you use the analogy of, never forgetting how to ride a bike. When I talk to my students about memory and we talk about the various theories of forgetting, most notably decay theory or memory trace theory, and I explained to them that one of the reasons why decay theory is really not an adequate theory of forgetting is because of all of the things that we don't forget, even through years of disuse. And I usually pick an older student and I say, when was the last time you rode a bicycle? And they'll say 10, 15, 20 years ago. If we went outside right now and I gave you a bicycle, could you ride it? Well, of course. So that's the idea as well. And it takes him just a few casts. He gets frustrated because he can't do it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have that the music increases and we see them close up on his hands and then he catches a fish. So a little cheesy, but also kind of fun.
But I mean, mostly accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been doing it for 10, 15 years at least before he leaves for Dartmouth. And then he comes back. And I can't speak to fly fishing itself because I have no idea how difficult it is. I'm sure it's really difficult. And so I can't speak to being able to regain as quickly, but it seems like, he got it back pretty quick.
Sure. Another good example for many of your listeners might be how many of us learned to play a musical instrument in our adolescence, and then we stopped playing it, and then 15 years from now, someone puts that instrument in your hands, and 20 minutes later, you're 80% of the way back to where you were when you gave it up. So sort of a similar concept.
Yeah, I really enjoy that. That was a great connection for me just because of where my head's at these days in planning for the courses. So I wanted to pick your brain on some of the morality issues that you found in the film. So you want to speak to that?
Oh, sure. There were several areas where it seems to me that the film is sort of pressing us to think in terms of moral or ethical dilemmas. Some of them more obvious and some of them less obvious. I mean, the more obvious ones where, the boys get into a fight and they can't be manly until they've spilled their blood in fights, or in battle, as they say. Going down into the street and the little boys shaking their hips at the women in the house of ill repute. And all of these things, of course, testing the world, trying to find where the boundaries are, while at home, the good Reverend McLean is writing his sermon for Sunday's church. So there's sort of a nice juxtaposition of the children testing the morality of life, while the Reverend is at home sort of polishing it.
Yeah.
The Reverend is also an interesting character. You and I were speaking before we started recording today about a scene where he demonstrates a little bit of bias, perhaps a little bit of prejudice, when he finds out that his now grown son, who's a reporter, has changed the spelling of their last name and has capitalized it. And he says, now everybody's going to think that we're lowland Scots, and sort of demonstrating a bias against people from a different part of their historical heritage.
Right, and it's probably, well, in the early 20th century, I would imagine the Reverend is maybe first generation Americans, so Norman and Paul are second generation Americans. And that would be my guess as far as the time period is concerned. So, they don't have a connection to Scotland like the Reverend might because of his parents coming directly from Scotland, emigrating from Scotland. So I thought that was interesting too. It's odd that the Reverend has these peculiarities, and it's probably has to do with the frequent maybe comparison's not the right word. Frequent mentions of Christianity differences among the groups that are in Missoula, Montana.
Yeah, he refers to Norm's girlfriend's family in a sort of peculiar way, running them down for having a different denomination. And so, even the high figure of the spiritually untouchable Reverend demonstrates a few ambiguities of his moral character. Another area where this idea of ethics and morals and choosing the right decision really stuck out for me, and sort of relating it back to psychology theory, is the moral decision-making model of Kitchener.
Okay.
And this is one that I first really came into contact with when I was doing clinical training.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who aren't familiar, Kitchener's model has 5 basic tenets to it, that in order for something to be a moral choice or an ethical decision, it has to adhere to the premises of autonomy, justice, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and fidelity. And of those 5, and I'll spare everybody the lecture on what they are, the 2 that really stand out for me are fidelity and autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Fidelity, of course, is the idea that, going back again to the Reverend, that nothing is more important than faithfulness to your tribe, to your kin, to your family, and of course to Scripture. And it's very distressing to him how he sees Paul sort of casting his family aside, and also casting aside, the ethos with which he raised him, and that's an interesting subplot. In terms of autonomy, the idea that we should respect people's independence, this is a great struggle for Norm throughout the movie. As children, how much does he try to drag his younger brother back to the fold? How much does he try to calm down Paul's nature of being rebellious? As an adult, when Paul is dealing with these addiction issues, alcoholism, gambling addiction, and so on and so forth, Norm has a clear struggle for where do I tell my brother I'm going to drag you back by the collar of your shirt, and where do I respect your right to make your own choices, even if they are wrong choices? We see that as a secondary issue when he's dealing with Jesse's brother Neil, who I will describe as an ultimate tool bag. And he wants to help Neil, but also recognizes that Neil is probably beyond help. And one of the interesting dialogue moments is when he's talking to Paul about Neil, and he says, "How do you help that son of a gun?" And he doesn't say gun. And Paul says, maybe what he likes is somebody trying to help him. And I thought that was really interesting, because Paul seems to me, forgive me for going Freudian, Paul's projecting right onto Neil. I don't want you to help me, but I like that you're trying to help me. And
I don't know.
That's a theme.
We don't have to be Freudian. We could just say that Paul was talking about himself.
Okay, well.
You don't have to bring Freud into this.
He projected.
Or he was just talking about himself. I do like that application, and especially with Norman being the parentified child, as you noted, because he does handle most of the raising of Paul, because you see a split happen when Norman goes off to Dartmouth. That's when Paul decides, okay, I'm going to go to college myself, but he stays in Missoula, and I guess goes to the University of Montana. I think that's the one out there, in Missoula. But then he goes and takes a job in Helena, and that I was curious about the distance, and it's about 150 miles away from Missoula, and that's a long distance to travel in the 1920s.
Yeah, you're not going to have cars going 75 miles an hour down the turnpike. It's going to take you a while to get back.
Right.
And as a result, you're not going to come back very often. And we see that, the infrequency with which he does come back. The Reverend's wife makes this big deal about, I'm going to set out towels for you, and I'm going to set up your room for you.
Right.
It's not as if he's one town over and can swing by any time he wants.
Yeah, and speaking of the mother, she gets very upset when he abruptly leaves one dinner with the 4 of them. He just gets up and leaves, and she's like, "Oh, I thought we were gonna." Oh. And then she sort of remembers her place, which is another line of conversation. The Reverend's wife, the dutiful woman, the homemaker, not speaking up against the male family member, even though it's her son.
And it's always sort of puzzled me as to whether her angst in that moment is because he's leaving, or is it because she knows where he's going, or both. And in either case, she knows that it's not her place to say anything.
It's
As the
probably
mother of the 20s.
all of the above. It is.
Yeah.
It is definitely all of the above. In that case, I think she knows, or at least has an idea of the crap that he gets up to. Maybe not knowing fully that he's in a lot of gambling debt, but I think she knows. But we can let's save the gender roles for a little bit, because there's more to say on just all of the gender roles and in among all of the characters, I think. But before we do that, let's take a quick break, and we'll come right back. Hey, listener. Thanks for sticking around this episode. I hope you're enjoying it. Anyway, I need your help in growing this podcast's audience. In past episodes, I've asked you to share this podcast with 5 of your friends. Let's keep doing that. Share this podcast on social media, especially if you really liked an episode. Share that episode. Tell 5 of your friends or family if they have an interest in film or psychology, or even better, both. Growing the audience is our goal for the second year of programming, and so we need your help to get that done. Other ways to contribute to the podcast include tips to our PayPal, found on our website, becoming a patron at patreon.com/cinemapsychpod, rocking some sweet merch from our Spreadshirt shop, and or leaving us a rating or review on your favorite podcast service. Now back to the show. Alrighty, so just before the break, we you mentioned some gender roles, and I said, hey, put a pause on that. So here, let's bring that into the fold, because I think every single character in this period piece flouts some aspect of gender roles in frontier 20th century America. So you mentioned the mother, the dutiful Christian wife of the Reverend. She was a homemaker, and we don't really see her much outside of the kitchen/dining room in that movie, and so obviously purposeful, right? But I think one of the bigger gender roles is not necessarily among the characters, but just overall, which is the idea of machoism, masculinity, and what I think a lot of gender researchers these days would call toxic masculinity. Right? You had mentioned it earlier in the show about how the brothers need to spill their blood in order to prove that they are indeed men, and they do this as boys. By the way, Joseph Gordon-Levitt as young Norman in one of his early roles. So I thought he did it well. So the idea of being a purposeful and traditional manly man, right?
I think that's correct. As I mentioned before, the idea of the kids, you can't be a man until you have spilled blood. They watch the 2 older drunkards fighting and cut to the scene in the schoolyard where now the 2 kids are fighting. I should also mention that Joseph Gordon-Levitt had a lot to learn about how to act a fight scene, but okay, we'll let it go. He was a kid.
Wow.
Right? Hey, there's the criticism.
That's shade.
Serious shade at Joseph, and he cares what I think.
Mm-hmm.
But we also see it coming, all the way through their adolescence, into their young adulthood. One of the more amusing scenes was when they are out. The boys shimmy down the gutter pipe and sneak out of the house, which is sort of a rite of passage. and they're passing around the liquor bottle that one of them probably swiped from their parents' bar, and they go to shoot the chutes. They're gonna steal a rowboat. Okay, here we go. We've got to test the waters of masculinity by stealing something, and we're going to go down these absurd rapids, and we'll die famous. And the idea here that they've got to prove something, both to the world and the brothers to each other, as we sort of have a sibling rivalry happening here. It all goes back and forth with this coming of age and making very foolish decisions that in certain circumstances could have been disastrous. So toxic masculinity is a pretty good description.
And I will add just to that, to the which is connected to Paul's alcoholism. When Norman visits Paul at the Helena newspaper, and it's like 10 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and Paul pulls out a flask and takes a drink and then hands it to Norman, and Norman's like, it's 10 o'clock.
A little bit early for me.
Yeah. And then he's like, what are you, some sort of pansy now?
The East Coast has made you soft.
Yeah, are you soft?
Right?
Because what's wrong? I mean, let's be honest. Of things that are soft, what's wrong with them? So there's my plea there. But and then so he takes him up on that and takes a swig, and it's just like, because it's probably pure moonshine, pure bathtub gin. And then Paul takes a drink and is unfazed by its toxicity. I thought that was an interesting little jab about masculinity. And the interesting thing that just occurred to me is that when they're fly fishing, they really don't show it.
Okay.
There's really no masculinity.
A very, very small amount, as they're in competition for who can catch more fish, or who can catch the bigger fish.
Right.
But that's all. That's all sort of tongue in cheek to them. At the end of the day, I don't think they really care that much, other than who got the biggest fish. And there's a wonderful scene where all three of the men are fishing, the two boys and the father.
Yeah.
And the boys are arguing over who got the biggest fish. And then the father pulls out his winning biggest fish and says,
I'd say the Lord has blessed us all today. It's just that he's been particularly good to me.
and that was sort of an hysterical moment where he says, you know, boys, you might be good, but I'm still better.
Yeah, which is interesting from his character's perspective, because in his traditional gender role, he is the domineering father. And very early on in the movie, he is shown to be extremely rigid. I mean, telling young Norman to keep writing a paragraph. I will say, though, that I got a tiny smidge of validation when the Reverend kept telling him to now write half of it. And I was like, brevity.
Yes,
brevity.
Parsimony.
And because that's what I teach all of my, especially research methods, is that, brevity wins the day. Be concise. And I use Daryl Bem's exercise on that one. I guess it comes from Strunk and White, but Daryl Bem used it in How to Write, in his paper How to Write Good. GUD, I think is how he wrote the title. But from Strunk and White, where they give this huge paragraph and then they cut like pretty much
90% of it away.
Yeah, something like that. And I was like, wow, I guess Norman McLean was E.B. White or William Strunk.
It's interesting because that's an awesome scene, and then of course when he finally gets to write, he says, "Now throw it away. It wasn't really worth much to begin with, and now you can go fish." You mentioned that the Reverend is very domineering, and sort of that brings us to another concept from psychology. I know we've sort of moved away from the gender role conversation, But the parenting styles, the work of Diana Baumrind, and thinking about the way that the parenting interaction works, to me was really interesting because the Reverend is both authoritarian as well as uninvolved at the same time. And perhaps at different times, he has different ways of parenting the children. And this may be a function of the age, where fathers did certain things, and then it was left to mothers to do the nurturing.
Right.
But you don't see much in the way of endearments between the father and the son.
Mm-hmm.
The only real expression of love is indirect through the fishing.
Right.
And there's one scene where, going back to that scene where the three of them were fishing together, Norman and the Reverend are sitting on the bank watching Paul fish.
Mm-hmm.
And the Reverend just reaches over and he pats Norm on the leg. Do you remember that scene? It just sort of just pats him on the knee.
Yeah.
And that is one of the only expressions of affection throughout the entire movie. Another one after Norman gets a professor offer, and the Reverend says, "I am pleased."
Yeah,
I am pleased.
So strange.
Right, and Norman's heart is exploding at that moment. It's the closest the Reverend can ever come to saying, "I love you and I'm proud of you."
As time passed, my father struggled for more to hold on to, asking me again and again had I told him everything. And finally I said to him, maybe all I really know about Paul is that he was a fine fisherman. You know more than that, my father said. He was beautiful. And that was the last time we ever spoke of my brother's death. Indirectly, though, Paul was always present in my father's thoughts. I remember the last sermon I heard him give, not long before his own death.
Each one of us here today will, at one time in our lives, look upon a loved one who is in need and ask the same question. We are willing to help, Lord, but what, if anything, is needed? For it is true we can seldom help those closest to us. Either we don't know what part of ourselves to give, or more often than not, the part we have to give is not wanted. And so it is those we live with and should know who elude us. But we can still love them. We can love completely without complete understanding.
I just think it's interesting how at different times he occupies those different parenting styles, and that's a really interesting discussion topic for classes, because we often have students say, well, what kind of parent am I going to be? And I tell them, don't think of these as discrete. They're continuous. Everyone who has children at one point or another is all of these four. And so it's not, A, B, C, or D. It's usually a mishmash of all of them on some level.
Yeah, and I'm going to give a shout out here to Michael Wells from the STP group. This is an abridged version of the Your Thoughts segment, because I think he's the only one who added something to. I mean, it's an obscure film, so I'm okay with that. But I asked what people might use this film for in their teaching, and he wrote dealings of family loss, dealings with addiction, gambling, not feeling loved by your father, the role of institutions like church, and that institution's role in maintaining the social order, which is what the Reverend espouses pretty much throughout the entire film. Rivalries in families, and how marriages of religions might affect couples' relationships. We'll talk about Jesse in just a second. And how birth order might actually affect your personality and life choices. Super correlational stuff, but I thought that when I read that from Michael, I thought that was actually quite interesting. How older siblings might tend to become parents themselves, whereas younger siblings need direction. Of course, I say that with the broadest of paintbrush strokes as I can. Having the actual opposite happen with me and my sister. So yeah, I thought, and so thank you, Michael, for adding your thoughts on that. That really kind of helped me put my watching into a little bit more perspective. So I appreciate that. Back to the gender role conversation, just really quickly, because we have to highlight one other character that we haven't really talked about yet, which is Norman's future wife, Jessie. She's introduced quite early in the film as a woman on at a bar. I'll just call it a bar, and they meet, and then he tries to ask her out over the phone, which is hilarious. Old style phones, man. Hi, Mrs. MacArthur, whatever her name is. Can you connect me to Jessie? Yeah, I know it's long distance. So good. So they end up having an interesting kind of courtship, we'll call it, because she is more of a free-thinking woman. And what did you learn, Jason? What did you learn?
Oh, you're going to embarrass me. So,
yep.
Jessie's character, early on, we learn that she had tried to go to college and had not continued, either because she quit or she flunked out. And someone says, what did she major in? And her little brother pipes up, he says, flapperism. And for all of the years that I've enjoyed the movie, I never knew what flapperism or what a flapper was. I always thought it was some sort of fashion trend, or maybe the skirts of the Roaring '20s. And I just recently learned that a flapper is a girl of the 1920s who pushed boundaries. Someone who did not fall into what she was expected to do and sort of bucked the trend. And not to sort of digress into other movies, but it reminded me of some of the characters from Footloose, most notably John Lithgow's daughter, who's prim and proper until he turns his back, and then she's dancing to the music that they say is so owned by Satan. And sort of the analogy, or the parallel there is, once again, reverend's daughter, a minister's daughter, or in this case son, sort of bucking the trend. So her flapperistic ways really pushes Norman, because he is raised to expect a demure, domestic, obedient woman. That's the mother figure. And Jessie is anything but he's really, really taken with her.
Yeah, and I think there's a really great scene that sort of encapsulates their entire relationship, and it's after he takes Neil out for fly fishing, and he ends up just having sex with a drunkard woman from the bar, and
Neil has sex with her, not
Norman. Sorry, yeah. And Neil and this other woman, who kept calling them Buster, I think, something like that. And they end up getting like terrible sunburns because they fall asleep on their stomachs in the middle of the woods. But Jessie is very mad at Norman for letting her brother end up that way, and he's like, well, I need a ride back home, and she's like, all right, fine. So first of all, she's driving the car, and second of all, she's like, oh, there's some sort of accident down the hill, which is a more direct route to your home, but you know what? We're gonna take the train tracks, and we're gonna go through the tunnel,
and we're gonna come out on a bridge,
and we're gonna come, and then I'll get you home. So it's just like she is unflappable. You see what I did there?
I see what you did there.
Which would have been quite a deviation from the norm of the time, especially in frontier, in the frontier West.
And they accentuate it when she's driving on these tracks across the bridge with about an inch to spare on either side of the wheels. You can see Norm kind of losing his mind, and he's like, trains come down here all the time, and he's looking over the edge and sort of moving closer to the middle of the car. and she never even turns her head. She just kind of looks sidelong at him and sort of gives this evil smile as if, yeah, I got this guy. He's mine now. And it's a great scene.
Yeah. So as far as gender roles are concerned, not a traditional woman. And what Jason would now call a flapper.
You know, I'm glad that I understand the term now. Every time I watch, I'll remember what flapperism is.
Yeah, man. There you go.
She majored in flapperism. I wonder if that's a subtle nod to she got thrown out of the college for not being sort of a demure good girl. One of the areas that I always like to look at is, having been sort of a humanist at heart, looking at some of the work of Rogers and going back to the relationship between the Reverend and his sons. We spoke before about this idea of, how they were raised in an authoritarian background, authoritarian parenting. That I think that really naturally brings in a conversation of sort of unconditional positive regard versus conditions of worth. And from the earliest scenes, we see that the Reverend is much more approving of Norman than he is of Paul. They don't try to hide that. And, Norm goes off to college, and Paul sort of fusses around as a lifeguard for a while before he ends up in college. Norm gets himself a respectable career, and Paul's a journalist, which I suppose for them was less than the ideal model.
Yeah.
And so I think there's sort of a nod to the idea that some of Paul's struggles may be an attempt to find himself as he's seeking out that approval of the father figure that he's not going to get, except for perhaps maybe 10 seconds when he catches the ultimate fish. And then, as you mentioned at the start of our conversation, skip to, okay, he's dead. So maybe that's the climax of his life. I got the fish. My father approves of me. I don't really need to be here anymore, kind of thing.
Yeah, he did say that he was never going to leave Montana. And he didn't. Now he didn't end up dying in the way that you would hope that he would have, like a long life and potentially doing what he loved, fly fishing. But he didn't go out with a whimper either.
Well, what I really would have anticipated the first time I watched the movie is some sort of alcohol-related death. A driving accident, or maybe he tries to shoot the chutes again as an adult. But it's actually his gambling addiction that costs him his life. And for those who've seen the movie but didn't catch it, all of the fingers, I think it was on his left hand, were broken.
All of the bones in his right hand were broken.
Right hand, okay. And that's, of course, because that is the hand that you traditionally hold your cards with. And so he was killed over gambling debts that after a while, the debts were called in, he couldn't pay them, and that was his comeuppance. So
I read that a different way. Actually. That he didn't go down without a fight. He broke the bones in his hands by punching.
Oh, no, I read that very differently, that either during or after his death, they shattered all of the bones in his hands to tell him, if you're going to play cards and you're going to lose, you better be able to pay up, Sonny. Because earlier in the movie, when they won't let him play, they said, so long, Sonny. And it just seems like he's tangled with the wrong bad men for too long, and this was the consequence. So,
right. I mean, I don't disagree with all of that. I just, I think that when he did get his comeuppance, he fought for it, and that's why he broke. That's why he ended up breaking, because that's usually your right hand, if you are right-handed, is the stronger punch, and so if he was going for someone's face,
it could be. But I always read it differently. But that's okay. You know what? Maybe both. Maybe both.
I don't think both.
I don't either.
But we'll agree that you were wrong.
That's okay.
Okay.
I've been wrong before.
So a couple more things that I want to add here is I really did enjoy the scene with Mabel, who was a Native American woman who is very briefly in the movie, just a fling of Paul's apparently. And it was, as you mentioned, it was, to buck all of the trends of the day. And he does it with such gusto, like he doesn't care. But it also gives you a window to how the frontier West at the start of the 20th century was extremely bigoted and racist toward Native Americans, and it was literally their land. He throws it in front of in all of their phases.
Yeah, the day of the speakeasy where you have to have this special knock to be let in, and then they say, "Come on, Paul." He's walking in with a woman who they would typically disallow, and he says, "You know the rules," and he says, I just flat out don't like the rules." And then the waitress won't serve his date, so he makes the waitress serve his date, and then in a final middle finger to the establishment, not only does he get up and dance with her in front of everybody, but they sort of clear the dance floor with all of their swirling and twirling, and he's making sure everybody knows you're not going to tell me what to do, and I'm going to take your rules and sort of throw them right back in your face. And again, he's challenging them, and, that's what he does.
Hey, here they are. Brother. Hi.
Hi.
Jesse, this is my baby brother, Paul. And this is Monacita.
Mabel. Hi.
Shall we?
What do you say, Paulie?
Hey, Paulie.
Hi.
Murph.
Preacher.
Preacher?
How are you, Murph?
Long time.
Good to see you.
You know the house rules as good as I do, Paul. No engines. Period.
I just flat don't like the house rules, Murph.
Me neither.
What are you gonna make me do here, Paulie?
Just get us a table for 4.
Last time, Paul.
Hello, Judge. Paul. Oh, you can get him back. Get drunk and dance naked on his table.
Yeah, beat hell out of this son of a bitch.
To note, the dancing is very much taboo because it's gyrating and very close. Not dance moves that people were doing in the 19-teens and 1920s, unless you were unless you were a flapper.
Yeah, he was doing a little bit of sort of the dirty dancing and the hips moving together, and that was the kind of thing that just wouldn't be seen. So in every metric of thumbing his nose at the establishment, he is not only happy to do it, but he's going to put it right out there in front of everybody.
I want to thank Jason Spiegelman for joining us to discuss A River Running Through It, because it ran through it, and sometimes it runs through it. Depends on what tense you're in, right? So he's shaking his head right now because he doesn't like my joke. We've done the joke about 3 times. So Jason, as we end, while you're saying goodbye, is there anything you'd like to plug?
Oh, I appreciate it, but given the way coronavirus has sort of shut everything down that we're all doing, I don't have a whole lot of plugs right now. Maybe I'll briefly mention that the annual conference on teaching, which is being held in October, has gone virtual, and it'd be great to have people show up for that. I was looking forward to having it in my hometown this year of Pittsburgh, but maybe next year or the year after. But other than that, I just wish everybody a good, safe semester. I hope you all avoid the coronavirus, and I really appreciate being back on your show. So thank you very much for having me, and fare thee well, everyone.
Thanks, Jason. Everyone, until the next episode, thanks for listening.